Good evening and welcome. You're watching our special summit on NDTV, the Solution Summit as India battles COVID. It's our worst ever health battle. This is our worst health crisis. Today, India has crossed over 260,000 cases, also a record number of deaths. We're going to touch 3 lakh cases this week. What do our best business minds think? What is the way out as we debate the battle between lives and livelihood? Joining me tonight will be Mr. Uday Kotak, the president of CII, and also MD and head of Kotak Mahindra. I'm also joined by Mr. TV Narendran. He's president designate of CII, CEO and managing director, Tata Steel Limited, one of our biggest corporations. Also Sanjeev Bajaj, chairman and MD of Bajaj Finserv Limited, vice president of CII, and Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee, director general of CII. Mr. Narendran, this is really an unprecedented time. Even just over 1 month ago, we didn't imagine India would be in this situation. What does CII recommend? What do industry bodies recommend at a time like this? Because this really is a battle. We know that Maharashtra is in lockdown. There's already a curfew. Delhi is likely to extend its curfew tomorrow. How do we actually face this battle?
Yeah. Thank you. I think from CII's perspective, we've had a few recommendations. One is, of course, the most obvious one is to increase the supply of vaccines, and from industry side to make sure that everybody who's eligible to get vaccinated gets vaccinated, because even as we speak, I think there are a lot of people out there who are over 45 who have not been vaccinated. The second part from an industry point of view is for us to ensure that people who we have influence over at least make sure that they do social distancing, they wear masks, they practice hygiene, because a lot of the workforce in industry and offices are below 45. So we have an influence over a lot of people and their families, and as industry, we need to keep communicating that, and we've been saying that. The third part is, of course, the industry is ready to step up and help the government in any which way we can. It could be on oxygen supply, it could be on supporting in anything else that the government wants us to do. And I think that's what as CII we've offered the government.
Mr. Bajaj, in your recommendations, you said, and just briefly quoting, factories and shop floors must be kept open for economic reasons so that production and supply chains are not disturbed. But in a situation like this, where we are balancing jobs and lives, and we've reached a situation where there's just no oxygen, there is no hospital bed. In places like Delhi, we've seen a terrible situation in Maharashtra as well. Is a lockdown perhaps not the better way to go? I mean, ultimately lives are more important.
Vishnu, even from the statement that we made a week ago, we are in a far more dire position today. And that's why a lot more probably needs to be done. The context that we were putting in place was, it's really the super spreader events, these large gatherings, and we are saying really, as industry, more than 10 people should not gather. Ban all these gatherings. That is the only way to break the chain. But you're also in a current situation where we have cities where we are busting the infrastructure, hospitals, doctors, and yes, that's why if you see, we are from the state of Maharashtra. Maharashtra has had to take certain more stringent steps. But even over here, industries which are more organized, where what we say is that people are at least spending 8-10 hours a day in a controlled environment. They are not super spreaders. It's actually a better situation to keep them there. If you keep them at home, what are they going to do? By the third day, they'll be out on the streets. So this is a more organized way to do it. We are also trying to balance lives and livelihood, because keep in mind the kind of fiscal and monetary benefit we got last year. We are not the US, we are not Europe. We can't afford to keep pumping that kind of money in. But I fully agree with your point that things have to get more stringent now than what they were even a week ago. And we can see some states doing that, some cities doing that, including my own.
Yes. No, just picking up that point, Mr. Bajaj, I'd like to bring in Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee here, because really at a time like this, the focus is partnerships, how all of us can come together and do our bit. Now, one of India's issues has always been over-regulation. We love regulating, and when we see today that India is a vaccine manufacturer, the world's biggest vaccine manufacturer, Corona, is in Pune, yet we don't have enough vaccines here. The question of asking for more financial support, for more funding to come in, for regulations to lift. Should private companies, CII had also requested earlier that why isn't the private sector being allowed in for vaccinations? And a big focus when you're looking at actually drug control, Remdesivir, lifting control licenses for more production, oxygen supply. Just to quote to you that the government put out tenders for oxygen plants, over 150 oxygen plants in October. not even one of those actually is operational yet. Do you think that's what really needs to change now in a health crisis?
So if you would have seen our statement and what we have been saying over the last 7 days, and things have changed so much in the last 7 or 8 days. But our main headline that we have been trying to say, do whatever it takes. Do whatever it takes to ensure production, do whatever it takes to ensure supply, and do whatever it takes to ensure also distribution. Now, this applies, we had mentioned at that point in time, from the point of view of vaccination. But at this point in time, it really one wants to reiterate that it probably really goes to other areas of like oxygen supply and medicines, as you mentioned. So and where we can play a role as CII is really see to it that we did it. We have done it last year. As you know, we did it for things like the ventilators. We did it for the things for things like the PPE kits. So it's not that India cannot do it. We, as business also, one can. But yes, you are right. There is a lot of partnership at this point in time required. A lot of bold steps required to see that we can cut around any red tape and regulatory mechanism to see at this point in time how on an emergency basis we can ramp up the production of what all are required at this point in time. And yes, in certain cases, like even oxygen, the government is allowed in its recent notification now even imports for the time being.
Right.
So I think we need to see and we need to do whatever it really takes to address the situation at hand at this point in time. The second more important point is we have a set of do's and don'ts which came out, protocols which were by and large dictated by the scientists or by the health experts on what should be done. But that is also in your show over today. We are seeing that there are issues where that needs to be tweaked and changed because it spreads in a closed environment. So I guess the most important point at this stage is to have those protocols laid out and also those protocols enforced in a very, very strong way.
Exactly.
Mr. Narendran, is it your concern that the pace at which decisions are being made at the government level are problematic when it comes to vaccines? For example, there is still no decision on the price at which the government is going to acquire Sputnik. There's still no decision on the nature of the funding to the Serum Institute, if that is going to happen. Mr. Kotak earlier on had written to the Prime Minister months back saying start vaccination. That started only much later. Again, we now find ourselves in this situation. Should that situation of decision making have happened faster? Should it continue to be much faster than it is?
You know, Vishnu, the government had set up the right platforms for it. They had set up NECVAC, and CII was engaging very closely with them. We ourselves created an internal team in CII to engage with the government. So we found that on many of the issues, our recommendations from industry went to the government and got translated into action. I guess the issue with the vaccines is something between the vaccine manufacturers and the government. And I think CII has offered to also play a role between the vaccine manufacturers and the government if it can help. But obviously, it's a conversation between them that they need to come to an understanding, both on the commercial terms as well as on the supply side. But I think on many other aspects of responding to it, I thought the government acted quite fast. If you really look at 1st March, they opened it up for people over 45. Very quickly, they allowed us to start vaccinating in our factories. And the ramp up from, if you look at January and February, it was quite low. But during March, it was actually ramping up quite fast. It's a different matter that the virus has come back and hit us even faster. But the rate at which we were vaccinating, if we continued at this pace and we didn't have the second wave, I think things would have been much better. So in hindsight, obviously, we can reflect on it and say maybe we could have decided faster. But I think maybe some of the commercial calls are something that the government can comment on.
No, I agree with you. Hindsight is 20/20. But just to look at the humanitarian aspect of this, Mr. Bajaj, because when CII actually wrote even a week ago that letter, we know that lockdowns hit the poorest the hardest because really it's about the daily wage labor, it's about factory labor, it's about people who are not paid if they don't come to work, who don't have an option of working from home. Money doesn't grow on trees. We know the government gave a heavy stimulus package last year, but how are we actually looking? And maybe the CSR of companies, and the CI could perhaps take a lead on this, is a sitting duck when we're looking at aspects which are specific to this pandemic. So, for instance, whether we're looking at funding for vaccine manufacturers, whether we're looking at, almost like work packages or wage packages for those who are out of work because of a lockdown. How can CII, I mean, India's biggest industries here, really take a lead in something like this? What are solutions perhaps out of the box which could come forward in the time of a crisis?
So if you see, even last year in the first wave, what CI did was really got large companies to put together their CSR plans for smaller companies which had CSR budgets but didn't have access to how to use that money. We helped coordinate that. CI was very clear, and our members were themselves very supportive of the fact that when we went into the first lockdown, we would protect wages for our employees. Now, you can't do it indefinitely, but we could do it for that period of time. It is something that cities that are currently under severe restrictions, the same is applicable. Keep in mind also what has changed in the last year is the whole work from home process has become far more streamlined to at least service industries. Manufacturing industries, you need to have people on the shop floor. There again, we are seeing at least things far better than what they were last year, and nobody wants to be in this particular position.
Right.
Problem becomes when you go to small businesses, informal businesses, that's where then the government needs to step in, which they did a great job last year. But we are hoping that, and maybe I hope it's not against hope, that this wave is a shorter wave. The acceleration on vaccines, the availability of oxygen, if we are able to take care of this quickly, we should not see as long a wave as last year, because a lot has happened. People are vaccinated. Today I was looking at a data which said 45 plus, probably 20% people have already got their first shot. Most of them can get their first shot in another 4 or 5 weeks. So we have to really focus on getting these things accelerated right now so that we don't have a much bigger second wave.
Mr. Banerjee, is it possible for the CII to sort of look into the future and look at the micro containment zones and things that people are talking about now, the steps which have been taken in Maharashtra which contribute so much to our economic growth, the steps which have already been taken in Delhi, and then forecast what a potential impact on India's economy is going to be?
Well, at this point in time, if you really look at where we are, I mean, of course, there is a best case scenario and there is a worst case scenario. If you really look at this point in time, obviously the contact-based services such as hotels or transportation and eateries, they are facing the stress due to cancellation of holidays and outing plans and so on and so forth. And there would be jobs at stress which are also being seen, especially in the informal sector. But if you really look at the manufacturing sector at this point in time, the setback is much less severe. There are, as you mentioned, there are certain local lockdowns that we have seen. But if we are able to facilitate, and towards the second part of last year, we were able to manage that quite well in terms of we established working groups which were seeing to it that supply chains were not broken. And if we are able to do that, I think that's something that that's extremely well, that requires a lot of planning as well as implementation. So that's one thing which is important. And the good news is probably that many of the high frequency indicators at this point in time are showing improvement, not only in comparison to what it was a year ago, but also in comparison to the pre-pandemic levels. And indicators like the GST collections, railway freight, manufacturing PMI, power consumption, and so on. And areas like tractors and construction equipment, they have registered a pretty much of a healthy growth. However, what's very, very critical is that these positive trends are based on data available till March, while the second wave of the pandemic really has spread in April. And when many of these indicators are likely to face some headwinds, and many companies are likely to face stress, especially in the services sector. So at this point in time, I would think that if we are able to manage the supply chain bottlenecks which arise out of micro containment zones, we would be able to handle it. And we believe that that's the right way to go, to see micro containment zones are in place and we enable the supply chain to function.
In fact, Mr. Banerjee, we've just, Mr. Uday Kotak has just joined us, President of CII. Mr. Kotak, thanks for being on the NDTV Solutions Summit. All the panelists have just said that even a letter the CII had written a week ago to the Prime Minister. Circumstances have changed so fast as we've been hit with this second tsunami of cases, as it were, the number of deaths. What are the emergency solutions that CII can actually recommend, or what would you recommend that as the top 3 emergency measures which need to be done now?
I think we need to divide it into 3 clear buckets. First is here and now. And in here and now, it is essentially oxygen, bed capacity, a medicine capacity, that is things like remdesivir and others, and vaccination. These 4 have to be here and now in terms of speed at which we gather all these 4. And as we have said in our letter a week ago, we as a country need to do whatever it takes. And it's not about price, it's not about anything. This is a crisis time, and we must go all out in these 4 specific areas of here and now action. Second is in terms of behavior and action and government actions. In the second bucket, I would go by experts. What are healthcare experts telling us in terms of hospital capacity, and how do we handle the load? And here we've got to keep in mind the experts themselves are horribly confused. Now I'm hearing that this could be an airborne phenomenon.
Yes.
Earlier, all this while, for the last 1 year, we believed it was particle-led, to now airborne. Therefore, we are all in many ways grappling and groping in the dark with reference to the virus itself. Therefore, I would believe that we should not be looking at who is at fault, but within the framework of what little we know about the virus, go with the expert view, including on capacity of the system for taking critical decisions on containment and restrictions. And third is, while lives certainly are the first priority, and undoubtedly, we got to ensure that we don't lose more lives through issues of livelihood.
Exactly.
We have seen the challenges of migration last April, when we did the very severe lockdowns, and people just ran back home into their villages. And that is a very frightening scene. Therefore, we should be very careful about disproportionate risk to life coming from livelihood as well. And therefore, before we take a call on something which is very extreme, we need to think through the consequences of that, some of which we have experienced last year. So 3 clear buckets. One is here and now, immediate area of supplies, oxygen, bed capacity, medicines, and vaccination. Second is, in terms of the next steps, don't rely on public opinion, rely on experts. Keeping in mind, experts themselves are in a state of confusion in many areas.
Right.
And the third really is, don't do things which create more risk to life as we go forward because of impact on livelihood. And keep in mind, this is a virus we don't know. We are playing COVID 2.0. We got to start preparing how we are going to fight in the future, because there could be a 3.0 or a 4.0. We do not know.
And we can't be. In fact, Mr. Kotak, just to ask you on that, in that sense, how can industry also come in and also battle COVID 2.0? Because one way, I asked your colleagues just now on the panel that, for instance, how can we get rid of this over-regulation of issues of whether oxygen can be given in Maharashtra, has to be cleared centrally by the center, how much vaccines should be given to a state is cleared by the center. How do we open up all the red tape at a time like this, which seems to be slowing us down? We stop export of remdesivir, but can remdesivir go to a particular state? There's still so much regulation, even at a time when it is literally a matter of lives.
It is a delicate balance. On the one hand, there are advantages of decentralization. On the other, there are risks of chaos. Okay, therefore we need some balance between some method in how it goes versus excessive control. And this is a balance which needs to be done. And the only way it can happen is if India functions as one seamless country in this hour of crisis. It is not center, it is not states, it is India. And if we take that as the primary objective and make it work, go beyond political differences, because this is a national crisis, we will move forward. Unfortunately, too much of politics is getting into many areas.
Absolutely, and I hope all CI will also commit. It would be wonderful if each industry said, we'll set up a hospital, we'll take charge of this hospital and make sure beds are provided on an emergency basis. Is CI looking at options that we can do in this way just to actually ramp up things which are actually simple, medical oxygen and infrastructure like hospital beds, convert maybe factories which are empty?
I think most large corporations are going out of the way in the area of oxygen and capacity. And I'll request my colleague Narendran, who runs Tata Steel and one of the largest producers of oxygen, how he is supporting the national cause, as also are many other manufacturers in the area of oxygen. Narendran, would you like to give specifically what you're doing at Tata Steel?
Sure, Uday. You know, even if you take something like oxygen, right? I mean, if you really look at it, there's supply of oxygen, which is actually available in plenty. The bottleneck is not the supply of oxygen. The bottleneck is how do you transport it? Because there are only some hospitals which have the storage. The rest of them need cylinders. So the bottleneck could be in the bottling plants, which need to bottle it in cylinders and supply. And the bottleneck could be the cryogenic tankers, which are required to transport the liquid oxygen, to the hospitals who can store it. So that's why some amount of control from the center, as Uday said, is important, because if cryogenic tankers are the bottleneck, you don't want these tankers spending 10 days transporting oxygen from the eastern part of the country to the western part. You want them to do shorter circuits and come back to fill up more oxygen and deliver it. So what the government is trying to do, if I look at Tata Steel, we are now supplying about 200 to 300 tons per day of liquid medical oxygen to 4 or 5 states in the eastern region, whether it's Odisha, Jharkhand, Bihar, West Bengal, UP, and MP. So we've been told that these are the states that we will ask you to supply. We said, fine. So every day we tell them what is the stock we have. We get, tankers lined up and we supply. And that's what is happening across the country. So I think the steel plants on the western side are servicing the states in the west and so on and so forth. So I think some sort of optimization has to be done centrally so that there's no chaos, as Uday said. But I think if you organize it well, at least you'll make good use of what is available. And I think industry is ready to step up and do whatever is required. And we're doing that. Even in terms of hospitals, I think many of us run, Tata Steel runs 1,500 beds of hospitals. So, many of the companies are doing that. So I think many of our members have clearly raised their hand to step up.
Look, we're out of time, and it's been wonderful getting all of your thoughts in on this program on how industry can really help in leading this fight to get us out of this mess, the importance of livelihoods and lives at the same time. It's very, very challenging for us at this stage. I'm sure you'll all agree. I'd like to thank all of you very much for being with us.
Thank you.